Welcome. Today we're going to be going over task B of the ACS for airplane flight instructor. No need for long intros. Let's just jump right into it. So I'm going to hop over to task B, the learning process on the ACS. And as you can see, the first thing that we're going to be talking about is definitions of learning. So I'm going to hop back to my doc. Right here, we've got an acronym called AMAP. This is basically the definition of learning. So it's a change in behavior as a result of experience. It's multifaceted, so it's happening from a bunch of different ways, like smelling, hearing, seeing. It can be learned from a lot of different senses. And then A is active process. You are continuously learning. So, as soon as you wake up, you're walking around, you are learning actively. And then P is for purposeful. If you have something that you're learning in aviation, for example, and you provide a purpose, you are more likely to learn it. Alrighty, and then next up, we have our learning theories. We have behaviorism and cognitive theory. Now, behaviorism, this is actually an older learning theory of ours. And what it says is human behavior that can be predicted based off of reward and punishment. So, for example, we have Pavlov's dog experiment. I won't go super deep on this experiment, but if you guys want to, just look up Pavlov's dog experiment and you can find this article, and I think that it covers it very well. But for an overview, the Pavlov's dog experiment, he had these dogs, and every time he would go to feed them, he'd ring this bell. And at first, these dogs didn't really associate it with anything. But after he'd ring the bell, he'd provide them food as well. And now over a period of time of consistency, the dogs actually started to salivate anytime that they heard the bell ring. And so what does this say? Well, when we hop over this, it actually proposes that behaviors can be learned through the association between different stimuli. So in this example, Pavlov would ring the bell, the dogs would hear it, and their mouths would start to salivate because they knew that food was coming up next. Now, what the frickin' heck does that have to do with aviation and how we can apply it? Well, human behavior is predicted based off of reward and punishment. So say that your learner actually is doing really well and they're studying and you can tell. And then you give them some sort of positive stimuli like, hey, I can tell that you have been doing great. Every time that we go in for a ground, you know what you're talking about. I'm really proud of you. Now that's going to obviously make them feel super satisfied and want to continuously do this. So that is a reward basically. And so that's how it can be applied to aviation. Now for cognitive, this is when we focus on the brain and the way that it observes, learns, problem solves, and makes decisions. Now for behaviorism, it's a pretty simple idea, right? We learn just based off of reward and punishment. But, as you can tell, our brains aren't that simple. We have a lot of complexity with them. And so these are all theories, right? But I think that when you learn them all and you learn behaviorism, you can actually take pieces of like, hey, I could totally see that I've learned this way at some point in my life. So I threw in this 3 right here for us to remember and to, apply them to being a CFI. So we're going to start off with the reflective thought theory. This is when learning is developed from the process of reflection. I'm sure you can think of a time where you've reflected on something and learned something from it. So how can we use this as an instructor? Well, CFIs, we can spark reflection by asking the learner to self-critique their flight during their debrief. It allows them a chance to look back on what they may have done great, what they may have done a little poorly on, and how they can fix it. And sure enough, they will the next time that they go up. So next up, we have I. This is information processing theory. Now this processes, stores, retrieves, and applies the information just like a computer would. So for example, we're on the ground and we're teaching steep turns. The student, their brain processes it, their brain stores it, and then say we go up and fly, their brain retrieves that information that they learned, and then they apply it to real world application. And then C is going to be constructivism theory. This is when learners continuously build off of old experiences. So laying down a basis, right? Something for fundamentals in a way. So for example, you must know air molecules want to go from high to low pressure before you can learn how lift works, right? There's some sort of building block that you have to go off of. And that is a few of the cognitive learning theories. The next up is perceptions and insight. And what are perceptions? Well, all initial learning actually comes from perceptions. And they are basically just received through our five senses. So sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch. I had to write those down because I couldn't remember them in that order. But our five senses, right? And so what is insight? Well, insight is when all of your perceptions come together to make a meaningful whole. And what does that mean? Well, I like to use the example for stalls. And if you teach your learners this way, like, hey, I want you to hear how it sounds. I want you to feel the way that it feels on the yoke, and actually make them bring in all of their five senses, except maybe don't have them like lick the yoke or anything, but like actually learn with all of their senses. They're going to be able to comprehend and like learn something a lot quicker than as if they were just seeing and hearing. So for example, stalls, you hear the engine slows down, it changes like a pitch, and then you see the airspeed decrease, you feel the buffeting, and these are all perceptions used to understand that there is a stall that's about to occur. Hence, all of your perceptions making a meaningful whole, which is the stall. So perceptions and insight, make sure that you teach people by using all of their perceptions. All right, and if you guys are enjoying this, I hate to ask, but please do the little YouTube thing. Just hit the like button, subscribe. And if you guys are enjoying this, please send it over to any other CFI candidates that may benefit from this. It will help me out a ton. All right, let's get back into it. Number 4, we have factors that affect perception. This is G step. And I'm going to start rushing through these because this is a long lesson. So we have G for goals and values. Every experience and sensation is influenced by a person's own beliefs and values. So for example, a CFI that sees their job as a CFI to just build hours to get to the airlines is going to teach and perceive things way differently than someone that believes that they are there to make a difference. Obviously, you want the CFI that is there to push you and to make a difference, and that is their goals and values when it comes to perceptions. S for self-concept. The self-image plays a huge role in a learner's perception. Confidence allows that learner to remain open to new experiences, while an insecure learner may want to discontinue learning when things get tough. T is going to be time and opportunity. A learner should be given enough time and opportunity to learn something, so don't let impatient learners rush things. For example, a brand new private pilot student should be given enough time to learn airspace, taxi and airport operations, how to land, traffic patterns before they're told to go in solo. Right? They need some time to be able to digest and learn all of that stuff. E is going to be element of threat, and remember, this is what's affecting perception. So a learner's perception is going to be narrowed if there is a threat to their safety identified. They will develop tunnel vision towards what is threatening them. So for example, I put here a flashing red light with an alternator failure. Maybe we pop the circuit breaker back in there and it is all good, but the student keeps looking over where they saw the flashing red light. This can sort of start tunnel vision to where they're not worrying about other things like aviate, navigate, and communicate. Alrighty. P for physical organism. A learner should be in good physical condition so that they can experience perception through all five senses. So, a pilot that has a plugged nose and they can't smell, electrical fire before they see it. So, that is why physical organism is huge. Number 5, acquiring knowledge. This is MUA. So first, the way that you acquire knowledge, we memorize it. Learners must be able to memorize information before understanding. Then once it's memorized, you can actually understand it, and students begin to organize this memorized information to eventually understand how things work. And then we can get to application. And this is actually just using the knowledge to problem solve. Laws of learning. We have Reaper right here. R is going to be readiness. So this is the basic needs must be met in order for them to be mentally, physically, and emotionally ready. What does that sound like? Sounds a whole lot like Maslow's hierarchy. So things you will notice apply from what you previously learned to what you will be learning as well. There is always some sort of connection there. E is going to be the effect, whether it's pleasant or satisfying feelings strengthen learning. So it could be either, oh, that was a really fun flight, like I learned so much. That is a way that you can learn. Also, you can learn from being absolutely terrified, like almost running off the side of the runway. You will remember what you did wrong because of that insane feeling that you got, and that strengthens the learning for it. So then we got exercise. Practice makes perfect. If you don't use it, you lose it. That's why we practice things. P for primacy. This mic is getting close because I want you guys to know how important this one is. If you're watching this video, then you're most likely going to take your CFI check ride. And what that means is you're a new CFI. Congratulations in the near future. Why is this one important? Well, let's read it. What is learned first has a long-lasting and near unshakable impression. So, if you're a CFI and you pretend like you know what you're teaching and you end up teaching your students something wrong, they may have that bad habit for the rest of their pilot career. It may be something that they struggle with for years to come, just because you didn't want to let go of your ego and ask for help for when you're about to teach something from another CFI or get advice in that sense. Instead, if you just hold on to that ego and you end up teaching them something wrong, they may have this bad habit formed and that they may struggle with for their career. So please, just if you need help, ask for it and teach your learners correctly the first time. That's all. Alrighty. Intensity. This is an engaging lesson will most likely stick than a dull one. For example, grounds. If you make grounds really boring, they're not going to stick that well. Now, I know, of course, it's hard to compete with going and flying, but you can definitely make grounds a little bit more interesting than dull. Next up is recency. This one's used a lot for check rides. So things most recently learned are best remembered. Of course, like going up and flying, like maybe the 2 days before your check ride and just busting out a bunch of steep turns, you have recency right there. It's easier to remember. So for the domains of learning, we use cognitive, affective, and psychomotor. And so cognitive domain, this is operating with our head. And so RUAC, this is an acronym that is very similar to MUA, but it's in the fundamentals of instruction. So I threw it in there. Why not? R is going to be rote, which is basically memorization. U is understand. C or A is application. And then we have C for correlation. So you memorize it, you understand it, you apply it, and then you take that application and you correlate with other things. For example, slow flight. And then you can correlate slow flight with short field landings because it's basically slow flight all the way down to your aiming point. The next domain of learning is called the affective domain. Now, cognitive, that worked with the brain on how you memorize and understand, apply, correlate. Now, the affective is actually when it comes to how you feel about something. So we use this acronym called au revoir. And this example I'm going to use is I walk in and I listen in on somebody's aerodynamics lesson. So I'm sitting down and I'm listening to this aerodynamics lesson, and this would be considered my A, my awareness. I'm actually listening to this presentation and it's going well. The next is the response. Say that they are just absolutely killing it, and I'm like, wow, this is a really good freaking lesson. The next would be value. I'd value this lesson. I'd be like, hey, I really love the way that they are explaining lift and all of the other fun aerodynamical principles. Then I'm going to my O, my organization. So I organize the way that I feel about this lesson. So I organize it. I'm like, damn, like they explain this so well. And then I integrate it. Let's say for this example, I organized it above the way that I teach aerodynamics. So now I start to integrate that into my lessons and I give it my own take on there because of the way that I experienced it with the affective domain. Now that may be confusing, but I hope that that was the best explanation ever. The next is psychomotor domain. Now we worked with cognitive, the brain, the affective domain, which is the feeling, and then we have the psychomotor, and that is the phalanges, the way that we actually use our psychomotor skills. Now the acronym, I'm not gonna lie, that's a hard one. It's not really helpful in any way, but I threw it in there anyways. Next up, the O is for observe, and then the I is imitate. You're gonna imitate like how they're performing the steep turn. So you see it, they're observing it, and then you imitate, and then you practice that, and then it becomes a habit. You habituate it. Boom. Moving on to number 8, we have characteristics of learning. RAMP, in other words. It is a result of experience, active process, multifaceted, and purposeful. Quite literally, the definition of learning, a map. Yep. Moving on. Number 9, we've got scenario-based training, CTE. This is when it takes a real-world scenario and challenges the student to problem solve. So CTE is the acronym of a way to present this scenario-based training to your learner. First, you want a clear objective. What do you want to teach them and why? Once you've identified that, you can move on to tailoring it to each student. What skill level are they at? Are they a private student just now starting, or are they a commercial student? We're talking about steep turns here. And then we have E for the environmental factors. So a student given a fuel emergency on the ground will have more time to solve than one in the air. So these are actually directly related to the type of scenario-based training you're planning on doing. Number 10, we've got acquiring skill knowledge. This is the CAR. Now, C for the cognitive stage. It memorizes basic knowledge, right? We have the cognitive working with the brain. We just memorize the basic knowledge. A is going to be the associative stage. Learner is able to perform the skill and assess their performance after. The learner requires focus and effort to perform the maneuver correctly in this stage. Now, this is a big example of what justifies which stage they're in rather than the associative or the automatic. Now you'll see in the automatic response stage, they're able to perform it with little effort, and this allows them to focus on other tasks. For example, if we're teaching how to turn, somebody in the associative stage is probably worried about holding that altitude as well. Now for the automatic response stage, they can perform it, and now their focus can go on other tasks rather than having to worry about trying to hold that altitude. Number 11, we have knowledge of results. This is pretty important. So it's important for learners to know when they are right and when they are wrong. Learners should be told immediately when they're wrong and not allow them to practice mistakes. This kind of goes back up to like Reaper, right? Exercise and also primacy here. And then knowledge of results, it's good for them to know what they're doing well and what they're not, what they can work on so that they have some sort of picture in mind of what to achieve. Number 12, we have how to develop skills. This is the power law of practice. So speed and accuracy of a skill increases as the power of number of times the task is repeated. So practice makes perfect. And you'll notice that this lesson plan goes over a lot of the same stuff in different words. Number 13 is learning plateaus. Plateaus are when learning tends to slow down after a rapid amount of progression. Everyone will experience learning plateaus, of course, eventually, especially people that are moving at a really fast rate. It is important to let your student know it is completely normal and to just continue practicing, and that is how to get out of a learning plateau. Number 14, we have types of practice. This is DBR. So first we have the deliberate, which is the initial type of practice. We have one specific goal and a detailed plan, and then we follow it by specific feedback with them. B is going to be blocked. This is the middle stage where practicing over and over again until reaching the automatic response stage. And then R is random. This is the final, like right before check ride. You're basically mixing up skills and helps with retention. Use this when we're in check ride prep. Hey, let's rip a steep turn. Okay, great. You just did that. Set me up in slow flight. That is the type of random practice that we can do. 15 is evaluation first critique. Now, this is kind of what's happening when you take on a new student versus a student that you've been flying with. So for evaluation, a broad assessment of the learner's performance. This allows the instructor to check teaching effectiveness and then can be used to predict possible learning proficiencies and deficiencies. So for example, you get given a student from another instructor, you might want to just evaluate them for that flight. You might want to just be able to see this broad assessment of like, hey, how do they hold straight and level? How do they do steep turns? How are their landings? Rather than making this first lesson like constructing them. Now for the next one, it's critique. An instructor makes sure a skill is being developed correctly by monitoring the practice and providing feedback. Make sure constructive criticism doesn't involve any ridicule either. So for example, you had went up with that one student that you evaluated and you're like, okay, we can actually work on some landings today. And then that lesson is performed for the critique. And so, hey, let's round out a little bit earlier because we're hitting the nose wheel. So being able to critique them in that way. And one thing is to remember, we don't ever want to ridicule anyone. So think about the way that you're saying these things when you're critiquing. Number 16, we have distractions, interruptions, fixation, and inattention. These are all very similar, but there are distinct differences. So distractions, this is an unexpected event that can disrupt the learner's attention. For example, a passenger asks a question to the pilot while on short final, but the pilot decides to focus on landing first. Now, an interruption, basically distractions turn into interruptions. An unexpected event that the learner decides to divert their attention to. Distractions turn into interruptions, like I said. For example, the pilot decides to answer the passenger's question while on short final and ends up forgetting to make their position call on final. Now we've got fixation. This is when a learner decides to focus on one task above all else. For instrument students, they tend to fixate on a certain instrument, like the attitude indicator, and then like they'll disregard all of their other instruments. Next up is the inattention, when a learner doesn't pay attention to things going on around them. So fixation can lead to inattention, right? Because we're so worried about one thing, we're not paying any attention to the others. So an instrument student fixates on their altimeter. This is neglecting all of their other instruments. 17, we've got errors. This is broken down into two. We have a slip and a mistake. So a slip is when one intends to do one thing, then inadvertently does another. This signifies a lack of practice. So for example, the learner pulls the mixture back instead of the throttle because they just haven't practiced enough to where that they know the difference or where the placement is. Now a mistake, this one's a little bit more serious. I mean, obviously pulling the mixture is very serious, but for a mistake, it's when one intentionally performs a task incorrectly, signifies a gap in the knowledge or understanding. So they just purposely did it wrong because they thought that that was the right way. So example, dumping full flaps abeam the numbers. 18 is going to be reducing errors, and we have COLT Doctor as the acronym there. So C is going to be checking for errors. You always want to be scanning the instruments. U is going to be using tools, heading bug, altitude bug, timers, writing things down, checklist. L is going to be learning and practicing. So make sure that you are teaching and having your learners practice correctly. Do not let them practice incorrectly. T is taking your time, slow, smooth, and smooth is fast. That is the truth. D is going to be developing routines, have a flow when you take off, level off, climb, etc. And then R is going to be raising awareness. So understanding the risks and dangers that increase during certain situations. All of these put together will really help you reduce your errors. 19, we have memory. Memory is info that is retained for a certain period of time. And then sensory, this is when you receive info from the environment through your 5 senses. Info that isn't deemed important is discarded. Number 21, we have short-term and long-term memory. So short-term memory, this is info that's stored for about 30 seconds, and then after it may rapidly fade, or if it's important, then it may be transferred to long-term memory. It just depends on how you value it. And then long-term memory, this is basically unlimited information storage that is relatively permanent. So typically short-term memory info that is transferred to long-term memory has emotional ties like wedding days or passing of a loved one. Now for instructors, we should try to solidify important info by invoking positive emotions in the learner, like telling stories or making appropriate jokes. Because in long-term memory, there's that emotional tie with it, like wedding days or passing loved ones. So they'll probably remember what it's like to pass their first check ride because it's very emotional. They know that they put in a lot of work. So us being able to provoke emotion in them for things that are important is very, very useful. Number 22, we have how usage affects memory. So info that is used frequently and recently is easiest retrieved and used. Obviously, our recency, what we've talked about earlier. Forgetting, we have FOI'S. So fading, if you don't use it, you lose it. Like I said, we talk about a lot of the stuff. It's regurgitated. I is going to be interference, learning new information that could be similar to older information that has previously been taught can cause forgetting. So for example, we have different V speeds among different airplanes. You're flying a 182 versus a 172. All right, R is going to be retrieval. This is just lost between short-term memory and long-term memory, so it was never solidified. That can happen if you're, trying to learn something for a check ride, and then after you pass the check ride, it all fades because it never was solidified into the long-term memory. R is going to be repression. This is an unconscious effort to forget. So example, a student may have been in an airplane with violent turbulence when they were a kid, but they don't remember. So now they have a fear of turbulence when they're flying, which they don't know where it stems from. But suppression, this is a little different. It's a conscious effort of trying to forget. This is typically from an event that is upsetting. So for example, an embarrassing moment, like one of your friends brings it up and they're like, let's never talk about that again. They are suppressing it. So the difference between those two is your choice or if you subconsciously do it. 24, we have retention of learning. So the way that my friend told me about this, I can't learn without my lamp. We have the M for meaningful repetition, and it's shown that about 3 to 4 reps provides the max effect for retention. And then A is going to be association. It is easier to recall. It is associated with another thing. So for example, a learner associates anytime you descend, you pull the carb heat if you're in a carbureted engine. And then L, we've got learning with all senses, like we've talked about earlier. Using more than your eyes and ears to learn. That will help the retention of learning. Next up, we have A for attitude. Learners must want to learn in order for it to stick. Man, try to teach somebody that doesn't want to learn. They won't. All right, and then M for mnemonics. We have all of our acronyms, rhymes, and phrases, etc. Obviously, we love our acronyms as pilots, so mnemonics are huge. P is going to be praise, that behaviorism, right? So responses that give a positive stimuli. Transfer of learning. This could be positive or a negative transfer. So for a positive, if you have a past skill that aids a new one, then that is considered a positive transfer of learning. So for example, a new pilot knows that car engines really well. So the knowledge will be very easily applied to aviation engines because they have that basis, right? Now, a negative example would be if a past learned skill hinders a new skill. So for example, people that hop into the airplane and they try to steer the airplane with the yoke when they're on the ground, they are basically getting a negative transfer skill because they thought it would operate like how a car would. And that right there is all of task B for the ACS instructor airplane. Now, I know this was a long one. It is probably the longest one out of all the tasks, but please do that YouTube thing. Hit the like, subscribe, bell notification, all that jam. and I will see you guys in task C. Thank you so much.